Consider supporting this podcast on Patreon. On this episode of the What is Asia podcast, I interview Nguyen, a history Ph.D. student at the University of Maine and a Marilyn Blatt Young Fellow from the Society of Historians of American Foreign Relations, to shift the focus of discussions of the Vietnam War from the U.S. versus Soviet Union, capitalism versus communism, to another set of voices, manifest most notably in the Third Force Coalition. Thanks for joining us on this episode of the What is Asia podcast.
It's my pleasure being here. Thanks for inviting me.
So let's just jump right into some of these questions here. You talk about an area of the world that we've never covered on the show before, and a particularly tumultuous time period of this area, which is Vietnam during the Vietnam War. Can you first start by describing what kind of situation did the Nixon administration find itself in when they first assumed the White House? Because you sort of set the stage in your research with what's going on with him and his administration at the beginning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. So we know that after the Tet Offensive, so this was the general military campaigns that was conducted by North Vietnamese troops, as well as the National Liberation Front, which was the communist-led nationalist insurgency that was born out in South Vietnam in 1960. And so together, they coordinated a series of attacks into South Vietnamese cities that left them pretty much paralyzed for a while. And even though the Tet Offensive in 1968, Tet was of course, the Lunar New Year's in Vietnam. When that happened, that paralyzed a lot of cities, and it was a military defeat at the time, but in the long run, it was a military defeat for the North Vietnamese, of course, and for the National Liberation Front, but it was a political success, psychological success, because it demonstrated to not just the South Vietnamese population in the urban areas, because if we remember, right, the war had been fought mostly in the rural areas. It wasn't really brought into the urban cities until the Tet Offensive. So they demonstrated in a way to these urban people, as well as to the international public, that the war was going not as well as they were imagining, right? That South Vietnam was indeed very vulnerable to communist attacks, which by extension meant that a lot of the American foreign policies and strategies that had been applied in Vietnam up to that point had been more or less ineffective. So you had increasing anti-war activism that emerged both in South Vietnam and in the U.S. after the Tet Offensive. So when the Nixon administration came into power, it was faced with both, a powerful, obviously, a powerful anti-war movement in the United States, with, people wanting to get their children out of the war, their sons out of the war. They felt like the war was going nowhere. We're not really winning like we thought we were. And then, of course, there was also this emerging South Vietnamese urban anti-war movement that was pretty active as well in South Vietnam. So they were faced with, both of these different fronts, so to speak. And there was the need to kind of come up with a policy that would somehow allow the United States government to continue the war, if not escalate it, but without, worsening that same like anti-war activism that was so kind of boiling in both countries.
And so this leads us straight into the second question, which is you talk about something called the Nixon Doctrine. For people who don't know what that is, can you describe that and give context to that whole policy?
Yeah, so the Nixon Doctrine was, a lot of historians have studied about it, and it wasn't really a true doctrine. It was more so a strategy or a policy that includes different strategies that were aimed at, like I said, continuing the Cold War through, the Cold War here is not just the Cold with the Soviet Union, but also the hot war, right? The hottest war of the Cold War that was going on in Vietnam, and how to prosecute that war, continue to escalate it without, worsening those anti-war sentiments, like I said. And they were going to do that through pursuing détente with the Soviet Union, which was a cool down of tensions between the two superpowers, and at the same time with what's called Vietnamization of the American war in Vietnam. And I assume you would want me to talk about Vietnamization for a little bit.
Yeah, just briefly, if you could describe that a little.
Yeah, so Vietnamization is pretty much, the name explains itself. In the words of U.S. ambassador in Vietnam, Ellsworth Bunker, it was basically a policy to change the color of the corpses. So to replace, in a sense, to replace American ground troops in Vietnam with a well-equipped indigenous army that would be ARVN, or the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. So by militarizing young South Vietnamese men, and by giving them all of these equipments and high-tech weapons that were needed to replace the withdrawing American troops, so that they could carry on the fight. And that the logic behind that is that so that American troops would be able to withdraw, and that would help to cool down the anti-war sentiments in the United States. In effect, it's a policy, I would say, to escalate and localize the war at the same time.
Yeah. One thing that drew me to your research and what I found so interesting about it is that you really try to uh, shift the focus of your research from this, uh, communism versus capitalism dichotomy that has become ingrained in every, AP US history students, mindset
Yeah.
when thinking about the Vietnam War. I mean, I know that when I was in high school and we were in this portion of the history book, it was, Russia versus the US, this,
Mm.
great power politics. And the Vietnam War was presented as being a very top down issue. But
Mm.
you talk about something that's called the Third Force Coalition. So, uh, what is this coalition? Who is it? Who was it composed of? And why were they formed?
Mm. That's a big question. I do want to kind of echo your sentiments that you were, alluding to about this, the war being very much portrayed in binary terms. So the dichotomy between, Black versus white, U.S. versus USSR. That was the exact same way that I was taught in Vietnam. I grew up in Vietnam for the first 16 years of my life. And in history classes, that's the same thing that we learned was, I had no idea that there was even a third force that had existed during the war. It was very much about communist versus capitalist, North Vietnam versus South Vietnam. And of course, North Vietnam was supported, was given moral support and equipments and weapons and things like that by the Soviet Union, and to a lesser extent by China. And then South Vietnam was, of course, heavily supported by American funding as well as right, military support. Um, so it was very it was a big discovery for me, really, to find out about these different groups that
It
had
was a big
existed in South Vietnam
discovery
at a
for me.
time. Yeah, 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 and it's not a frequently studied topic until recently. There have been recent histories that have been coming out that have shed more light on just the diversity of South Vietnamese society at the time. It is a topic that is extremely difficult to study in Vietnam, mostly because anything that happened before 1975 remains very much, a politically sensitive issue. So we don't really get to see a lot of that except for, the main events that happen. A lot of that was portrayed, of course, through the lens of the post-war government. So to go back to your question, yeah, I feel like I should explain this a little bit because just to see I think the importance and the significance of these groups in general, but also about, why we need to study them, because the Vietnam War, just like the Cold War, in which it emerged, from which it emerged, um, it was kind of like a, drawn out, tragic, poignant, extremely bitter opera, right, with an ensemble that included, a wide, diverse cast of characters. And the Cold War was never about just the U.S. and the USSR. It had many different players in it, right, all with their own goals and identities, and some of them they share in common, but they also had diverse different visions as to what they wanted to get out of these struggles. And the same was happening in Vietnam. So we know of the first force. Usually in these histories they were called, the first force was the Republic of Vietnam, so this the South Vietnamese government in Saigon. um, the second force was the National Liberation Front that I mentioned earlier, that emerged out of this, the turmoils of the late 1950s, the early 1960s, when you have, elements, communist elements, but also nationalist elements that had remained in the South from the previous war with the French. And they were organizing with a lot significant support and influence from Hanoi to create this insurgency. So you have the National Liberation Front, which in 1969 merged with this coalition called the Alliance for National, or the Alliance of National and Peace Forces, which was itself a coalition of non-communist intellectuals and religious leaders. That's what they call themselves. At least they identify themselves as the non-communist people that wanted to join with the National Liberation Front to create the PRG, which was the Provisional Revolutionary Government. So that would be considered the second force. Now, even though, like I just said, these groups, an NLF itself, and then of course the PRG even more so, was a nationalist movement. It wasn't a strictly communist movement, but it was under heavy communist leadership and influence. But a lot of historians and also the communist histories themselves portray the PRG as largely a communist invention, right? So that's just one thing to keep in mind. The third force then emerged out of that context. These were the people who were in the middle, who were kind of like the members of the alliance, who were non-communist, but who did not support the South Vietnamese government, as in the rulers, right? So the Nguyen Van Thieu regime that came into power after 1967, or the Ngo Dinh Diem regime before that. So the First and the Second Republic of Vietnam, they were South Vietnamese who wanted to see a non-communist future for their country, but they didn't agree with a lot of the policies that were that were pursued by the South Vietnamese government at its time. But they also didn't want to identify with the communists. They didn't want to join the PRG. So together, and they weren't, there wasn't like a formal induction ceremony into this third force or anything like that. There wasn't a real umbrella organization that united all of these groups. It was very disparate. So that's why I call it an informal coalition of personalities, urban intellectuals. Most of these people had been educated, had received Western education, whether in Vietnam or in other countries. And they, together kind of subscribe to this political neutralism, so to speak. And of course, among these people, there were communist agents, right? Because you always have communist infiltration into non-communist organizations, all the way from the decolonizing struggle against the French earlier in the century through the American and Vietnam War. So there were communist agents inside the Third Force, just like how there were nationalists, non-communists within the PRG. But they were not the majority. And so I wanted to study just, to kind of learn more about these people in the middle. And they were extremely influential from the studies that I've conducted. And I feel like it's important to kind of, bring them to light.
I want to just go a little bit more into the Third Force Coalition, and that you talk about how it's comprised of several groups, but you seem to mention four groups in particular. Um,
Mhm.
and those are groups such as the Buddhist Church, Saigon Student Union,
Mhm.
Catholic Coalition of Journalists, and then oppositional politicians in the RVN government. So these are groups that are unified by their, uh, as you mentioned, their desire to sort of be in the middle, uh, you know, uh, to not be politically aligned with one side. But that in and of itself doesn't seem like a strong enough political policy to be able to unify all of these people all of the time. So,
Mhm.
were there goals in what they wanted to see as an outcome of this struggle homogenous, or was there infighting within this third force coalition between different actors that had different images in their mind of what the outcome of these struggles were supposed to be? And I guess as an extension of that weaken their political muscle?
Mhm. Certainly. You hit on all the right notes, pretty much with that question. And that's one of the challenges, and some of the challenges that I have to wrestle with when I study this topic. I mean, I knew that I always knew that I wanted to write about the third force or the urban opposition. The difficulty with that topic is not just about, the lack of sources, because as I said, it is a heavily underrepresented topic in both Vietnamese and American histories. But another issue with writing about this topic is because the personalities and the movements were very much um, diverse. It's just the sheer breadth and the diversity, the complexity of the topic itself that made it very difficult to kind of pick and choose which groups, to work on. And so it's just impossible to write about the entire thing, right? The entire coalition within one monograph. Um, a short answer to your question is that it certainly was a shortcoming of the Third Force Coalition. And when I chose to work on these four groups, I wasn't thinking about the fact that they were unified, because they were not unified in any sense, right? They weren't a solid block. There was one leader who kind of oversaw the activities of all these groups, or really coordinated their protests and demonstrations. But I chose them because I wanted um, to cover the groups that are most consequential, that were the most influential within the third force, but who could also kind of reflect the diversity of South Vietnamese society itself. At the time, I wanted to kind of choose the groups that would be the most representative of people. And so I chose the Unified Buddhist Church, Nguyen, because it was arguably the most influential, not always the most effective, and certainly it certainly had the most moral support among the people, because the vast majority of Vietnamese, South Vietnamese, were Buddhist. And then I wanted to look at the students because they were the most active and they were the most radical. I would say that there was probably the most communist infiltration within into the students' rank. But again, as I said, they were influential, the communist infiltration within the students, but they weren't the majority, right? The majority of students in Vietnam were still non-communist. And I wanted to look at students because I felt that they represented this young generation that was going to be the future of South Vietnam, if it were to have a future. I wanted to look at the progressive Catholics and the opposition politicians as a loosely connected bloc because Catholicism, even though it was still a minority religion at the time, if you look at the composition of the South Vietnamese government, both in the executive and the legislative branch, most people were, Catholic. So it didn't really reflect the demographic, the religious makeup of South Vietnamese society. It was a heavily Buddhist society, but it was a very much Catholic dominant, government. And a lot of the people within this opposition bloc of the South Vietnamese government were either Catholics themselves or they were associated with the Catholics. Like one of the famous opposition politician was Deputy Ngo Cam Duc, and he was a nephew of the Archbishop of Saigon. Um, and then finally, non-communist women, because I'm really interested in women in general. And also because women were the most, heavily impacted by the war. So I chose these groups for those reasons because I felt like they would do the best jobs of kind of being the representatives of the different walks of life that the people in South Vietnam at the time came from. Um, the I guess the common threads that they share in their activism would be, peace, because people, and it sounds kind of cliche, but most South Vietnamese women or South Vietnamese people at the time were just desperate for peace, right? Because the war had gone on for so long, there was so much devastation, and I don't even want to go into it, but it was just the not just the it wasn't just ecological devastation, it wasn't just the sufferings of human life and the loss of human lives, but the economy was in shambles. Society was uprooted. Vietnamese culture, these people felt like they were being existentially threatened, every day in all part of, of their lives. And so people wanted peace. And these groups, I think, found themselves in that position of speaking up, being the most equipped, I think, to speak up the demands of the people for peace. They also talked a lot about national reconciliation. So I felt like, to a lot of these people, that was kind of almost like an ideology. That was a goal, but also, an ideology that they were striving forward. They wanted to have some moments of reconciliation between the different sides, because a lot of people looked at the war as, a fratricidal war where you have brothers in the same family fighting with one another on different sides. And especially after Vietnamization, when the war was fought mostly by virtually, all by Vietnamese people, Vietnamese men, it just became too much, I think. And so people really wanted to have that kind of chance to reconcile one another again. The lack of an organization, a structure that could pull them together, the lack of that kind of overall, leadership certainly weakened the third force. But I also don't know if it would have been possible for them to organize in a way that would be effective, in the sense that you talked about, of having that kind of unifying force because of just the sheer pressure that they were under, having been repressed by the South Vietnamese government with, accelerated pacification program, which was the other part of the Nixon Doctrine. Um, this kind of effort by the South Vietnamese government to squelch urban dissent. And they were also, influenced by the communist pressure as well. So it was very difficult for these people to navigate and kind of form anything, more than they were. I don't know if that answered your question, but
No, definitely. It definitely, you touched on a lot of important points. Um, there's just a few more questions I want to ask here before we wrap up. So, um, one part of the question is, I guess, besides talking, uh, but besides using this topic to take the focus away from this, communist versus capitalist top-down way of talking about the Vietnam War, um, does talking about this topic help us revise our historical perspective in any other way? And if there's no good answer that you have for that, I sort of want to throw in another um, uh, aspect of this question that you could maybe jump off of, which is how have the politics of the Third Force Coalition lingered today, and how have the lessons from this political coalition been discussed in modern times, in 2021, for example?
Mhm. I feel like those two questions are kind of related to one another, in the sense that, I mean, besides that kind of this effort to complicate the war, the history of the war, to show that it wasn't there, that there were many shades of gray, right, in the middle, so to speak. Um, and wanting the my desire to kind of show the complexity of South Vietnamese society at the time, also the impact of Vietnamization and the Nixon Doctrine in general. As I said, I think that's the other goal that my dissertation, the hope of the dissertation is to kind of um, show the impact of Vietnamization, but from the perspectives of these urban groups. I think it does add a different dimension to our understanding of the US foreign policy during this period. In that sense, a lot of the histories that have been written about the Nixon Doctrine in Asia, about Vietnamization, about Operation Phoenix, those have been mostly through the perspectives of American determinants or the South Vietnamese government. And so I think um, to have a better appreciation for the consequences, the effectiveness or the lack thereof of these policies, studying the third force, studying how the urban population, which was, the least vulnerable to communist influence because they were surrounded by, right, by foreign powers and the Soviet Vietnamese government. Um, that would shed light on, understanding how they perceive these policies and how they reacted, how they were impacted, helps us kind of better understand, I think, the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of U.S. strategies in Vietnam during this period. Um, to answer your second question about whether there are any lingering lessons of the third force activism, it is very unfortunate that after the war ended, all of these groups were promptly disbanded by the new, government. Um, and a lot of that, of course, is because we now have a military solution that led to the triumph of the one party, right, system, that doesn't really tolerate the kind of um, activism that the kind of non-communist activism that was really contributing to that triumph in the first place, if that makes any sense. Um, so a lot of these people, some of them, some of the more radical elements of the third force were given some positions of power in the new government, but they weren't really real, they didn't really have any real authority to kind of make any significant change. A lot of them were later kind of suppressed or marginalized. Um, but I think that's kind of another reason why I wanted to study the urban activism of the time, was because I think it would offer lessons, I think, for the future generations for us today, not just in Vietnam, but in other countries, of how to effectively navigate, you know, the politics of the time in order to make, the change that we feel are needed in our society. Because the third force at the time was operating, as I said, under tremendous pressure from both sides, and they were heavily repressed. So I think in any society that, in which the activists are faced with the same kind of pressure from the government or from the powers that be, there would be lessons in that kind of history. That you don't even need to have an organizational structure. You don't even need to have a real force, so to speak, behind you, but you can still be a force that move, your country, your society, your community toward a certain direction that would be beneficial to your country. And I think for the third force, it wasn't a communist future, but it was peace. It was the end, the cessation of all of these destructions that were happening in their own country.
And just before we wrap up here, I ask this question of every guest we have on the show. If someone's listening to this podcast and they want to know more about, uh, the Vietnam War or the Third Force Coalition, or just maybe the social dynamics of Vietnam, what are, one or two books that you would recommend to someone?
Um, this is, like I said, this is a not very heavily studied topic. So the most I feel like some of the more comprehensive works on the third force certainly would have to be Sophie Quinn Judge's The Third Force. I forgot the full name, but the something like The Third Force: The Elusive Quest for Peace in South Vietnam. It came out a few years ago, and it's kind of the only recent monograph that explores the third force as the third force, and not as the urban opposition or the urban movements or some big terms like that. It's not a comprehensive study in the sense that it doesn't really, look at all the groups. Like I said, it's very difficult to look at all the groups really in one monograph, but it does explore the terminology, the way some of the more important groups within the third force saw themselves. A very recent book that just came out this year or late last year, I forgot, is Heather Starr's Saigon at War. It's not about the third force. It's not about the urban opposition, so to speak, but it does convey the same kind of complexity of and diversity of the South Vietnamese society at the time, also South Vietnamese political scene. So it does give you that kind of overall picture of how things were. Um, Overall, it's not. It requires more study in the future for anyone who wants to look at this topic. There was one saying that I thought was interesting at the time. In South Vietnam, that if Socrates isn't a communist, then Socrates is CIA, So it just kind of shows how, for a lot of people, there were only two paths that to walk, between the two lines of bullets, so to speak, was extremely difficult. And I feel like it's kind of this similar challenges exist for historians today who want to look at these groups in the middle. So, I think it's important to to look for more primary sources that can kind of shed light on these underrepresented movements.
Great. Thanks for again for joining us on this show. It was great to hear about your research.
Thank
And
you.
for those in the audience, if you'd like to see more content, you can go visit our YouTube channel if you're not there already, the What is Asia podcast, or go to nakotadefonso.com for more content. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, Nakota.